Hello. I started the recording. So since it's 10 a.m., we're about to start with this session. Today we have Richard Stark, who is a Matomo support team member and Matomo analytics expert. In his talk, Matomo Tips and Tricks, he will tell us more about a collection of Matomo features which you might not know about. So let's hear Richard for more.
Good evening from New Zealand. Thank you everybody for joining this MatomoCamp session for tips and tricks. All right, so for those of you who've never heard of me before, hi, I'm Richard. I am part of the Matomo support team based here in New Zealand. For those of you who maybe have sent us some emails over the past couple of months, maybe a year or so, you might have seen my name pop up in your email inbox, maybe now and then. So if this is not the first time, thank you so much for joining us. If it is the first time hearing about me, it's great to meet you all. All right, so as you saw on the previous slide, my session for today is titled Matomo Tips and Tricks. I've really tried to include a bunch of different tips and tricks for everybody, kind of from the everyday users of Matomo, as well as tips and tricks for those responsible for managing the Matomo setup or for Matomo administrators. All right, so I've broken down the tips and tricks into 4 different categories. They are number 1, UI tips, number 2, performance tips, number 3, useful CLI or command line interface commands and how to figure out what options to use. And number 4, useful free plugins that are not installed by default in Matomo. And then at the end of the session, we'll have a short Q&A session, so please feel free to pop any questions that you might have in the chat room during the session. We do have a dedicated chat room available for this live session on chat.matomocamp.org. I have asked the moderator to grab a few of the more interesting questions to answer at the end, just to make sure that we don't miss any of those. But you're also more than welcome to repeat your questions at the end if they do get missed. If we do have enough time, we'll also be opening up the floor to any questions at that time that you may have just randomly. So let's get started. Number 1, we've got some UI tips. So the first tip I've got for you today is called Zen Mode. So for those of you who have never used Zen Mode before, what it basically does is it provides you with an uninterrupted view of your Matomo reports or your Matomo dashboard, and it can be really, really useful for situations where you want to have a dashboard on a dedicated screen or a dedicated device for showing reports. For example, if you might have a dedicated screen in your office for looking at dashboards or pretty numbers and charts, that is the perfect thing to use for this. It can also be quite useful if you wanted to embed, for example, the entire Matomo UI into an iframe. So toggling Zen mode on and off can then allow you to quite easily navigate between the different reports within the iframe, and then when you want to bring that into sort of the full screen mode, you can quickly toggle the Zen mode and you have that awesome uninterrupted view of your dashboard or for your reports. So if you've never seen what the Zen mode looks like before, I'll show a screen which hopefully a lot of you are familiar with. This is what the standard UI in Matomo looks like. I'm pretty sure this is something that a lot of you see probably on a daily basis, maybe less so often for other people. But what Zen mode basically does is this. It gets rid of the top menu bar, it gets rid of the menus on the left-hand side, and in the screenshot here, I've kind of added the screenshot including the URL bar at the top, but obviously if you did want to have this on a nice big screen, you can go into full screen and you can have that really awesome uninterrupted view of your Matomo reports. So if you've never used it before, there's actually 2 different ways that we can get to Zen mode, how we can toggle it on and off. So the one option, of course, is to just click on our small little toggle button at the top of the page over here. The other option, which is my preferred option, is just to hit the Z key on your keyboard. And that allows you to quickly switch between Zen mode on and off. All right, so my next tip for you today is the search function shortcut. So the search function shortcut helps you kind of quickly navigate within the Matomo UI using your keyboard and keyboard arrows. So what it does is it allows you to search for and switch between websites and segments quite quickly without having to touch your mouse. It also doubles as a search tool to look for more information on the Matomo.org site. For example, you can quickly search up for user guides, or maybe you have a question or two that hopefully is answered in an FAQ. So most of you have probably seen the search bar up in the top left-hand side of the Matomo UI before, but if you wanted to quickly access this search feature, you just hit the F key on your keyboard. All right, the next UI tip for today is themes. So for those of you who've kind of used Matomo for a long time and haven't never really tried themes before, it's really something that you can use to kind of customize the look, the feel, and the layout of the Matomo UI. There are actually several different themes available pretty much for every Matomo user in the world that you can quickly install and activate on your Matomo to get a really custom look and feel. So some of the default ones you can see up on the screen now. For example, we've got modern, we've got the minimalist themes, we've got the dark themes, but then we also have some other themes that are specific just to customizing fonts, some that give you really cool visualizations, some spark lines, things like that. The really great thing about themes though is that you're really not just limited to these few themes that are available. Themes are completely customizable. You can customize them to your heart's content. And it really requires very little skill. If you have a basic understanding of CSS or maybe a little bit of less, you can customize as much as you want and then upload those themes directly to your Matomo UI. So if you've never installed or activated themes before, you're probably wondering, how do I download and install themes? Now, obviously, we can have a look on the website directly at themes.matomo.org, but you can also directly have a look at the themes from within your Matomo UI. So to do that, we just go to the administration icon, we go to Platform and Marketplace, and then we click on the drop-down menu and we select Themes. From here, you can select any of the themes that are available to download, but you'll also have a nice little button up at the top of the screen that lets you upload your custom themes in a zip file format that you can then install and activate on your Matomo instance. All right, the next section is performance tips. So one of the biggest performance improvements that you can make to your Matomo instance is to disable browser archiving and then set up a cron tab for archiving. So you might be wondering, why do we recommend disabling browser archiving? Now, for the majority of users out there that have very small websites or websites that might have only a few hundred visits a day, it's definitely not worth the effort going ahead and setting up those cron tabs and disabling browser archiving. But for those of you that are tracking a little bit more, maybe a few thousand hits a day or maybe tens of thousands of hits a day, this is probably one of the biggest improvements that you can make to the performance of Matomo, that you can see very quick and tangible results. So when we have browser archiving enabled, almost every time a user views a report, Matomo needs to process the report that they're trying to request. It needs to go and fetch all of that raw data. It needs to crunch all the numbers. It needs to put everything into pretty charts and numbers and lines and present it onto the screen. And it does this on the fly, or basically in real time. So you can imagine if you're loading a report that has a lot of data or reports that cover a long period of time, this can sometimes really slow down your experience with Matomo and can sometimes take quite a long time for those reports to load. This sort of effect can really be compounded when users are not aware of this, and they might be going around jumping through a bunch of different reports wondering, why the heck is this thing taking so long? What I mean there by compounding is, if a user clicks on one report, it takes 3 or 4 seconds to load and they don't see anything on the screen. They decide, hey, I'm going to have a look at this report. That report does the same. They can go through 5 or 6 or 7 different reports in a matter of seconds, and every single one of those reports, once you start loading them in the user interface, those requests have already been sent. The Matomo server is working on them in the background to try and process all that data. Now, the good thing is when they go back to those other reports that they've already requested the data for, it should load relatively quickly. The problem is if they come back and do that again in 1 or 2 hours later, it's going to need to do that whole process over again. So by pre-processing all of those reports using what we call a cron tab for the core archive command, and setting up a schedule, and disabling that browser archiving, we can be 100% certain that all of those reports can load really, really quickly, and your Matomo users can have a great experience. So this setting can actually be changed directly within the general settings of your Matomo instance, but it can also be set up by setting the specific config setting in your config.ini.php. But of course, if you're not familiar with messing around with the files directly on the Matomo server, disabling this within the UI is just perfect. All right. It is still important, however, to understand that there are going to be some cases where Matomo will still need to kind of process reports when they're requested from the browser. This is specifically important when you're requesting, for example, a date range report, because a date range report cannot be pre-processed. The other thing as well, if you have users who have created segments and those segments have been configured to be processed from in real time or on the fly, those segments will also be triggering some browser archiving requests. All right. The next tip that we've got for you has to do with segments. So what we talk about with segments when it comes to performance is we're talking about how far back segments are processed by default on your Matomo server. So when you have a segment in Matomo, if you're creating a segment or editing a segment, the default that Matomo is going to process that segment for is what we call the beginning of time. And that basically means that Matomo is going to process that segment from the very first day that you have raw data. Now, for a lot of people, this can mean that they're having to process segment data going back 2 or 3 or even more years, 5 or 6 years into the past. So this can have a really big impact on performance, especially for those people who have a lot of historical or a lot of raw data. So by changing this to a different time frame, for example, you can change it to automatically process only back 30 days. You can do it for 60 days or 3 months or 6 months or even a year. You can really customize and prevent your Matomo server from working too much on reports that you might not need to use. So to change this setting, we basically need to add the following to our config file. Now, if you're wondering how the heck are you going to remember this, all of this information is available. You can have a look in your config file. You can have a search for it on the Matomo website. You can hopefully find some more information about how to set this config file. Otherwise, if you wanted to look for this specific one, you can maybe take a screenshot or have a look at this recording afterwards, and then you can implement this into your config file settings. And of course, like you can see in this the slide that's on the screen, there's a few different ways that we can set this up. For example, the one at the top is the segment creation time. So basically that means that no historical data for that segment is going to be processed from before the date was created. So for a lot of people that are tracking maybe tens of thousands or even millions of hits every single month, this might be the most beneficial one. You can also have a smaller time frame. For the example, the one at the bottom is the last 93, so that's roughly about 3 months historical data. So now that I've told you how to disable browser archiving and to change how far back Matomo goes back to process all of this segment data, you're probably wondering, how do I get historical data when I've configured this setting in Matomo? And that brings us really nicely into our next segment, and that is useful CLI commands. Now, CLI is an acronym for command line interface, and that might sound really scary, but Matomo, when you install it onto your server, has a really cool, what we call the console script. And the console script allows you to run some really specific commands directly on your Matomo server that allow you to do things or accomplish tasks that you want to do. So we've got a couple of different CLI commands that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how to invalidate specific date ranges. So this is very useful for archiving specific segments further back than what we've just recently changed in our settings. We're also going to have a look at invalidating specific segments. And then number three, which is something that you might not have been aware of, is invalidating specific plugins. So if you don't know, Matomo 4 actually ships with a new feature that allows plugins that support that new feature to automatically archive reports going back a certain number of months. So for example, if you've just installed a brand new plugin or you've just purchased a premium plugin and you go ahead and install that onto your Matomo server, the great thing is that Matomo is going to go back and automatically archive the last 6 months of data for that new plugin. So that means that you have instant access to a great wealth of historical report data for that new plugin. However, sometimes it's still going to be necessary to archive reports going further back than what we've just set up in our settings. This is especially useful when you just install a plugin. You want to have a look at, what was the data for this plugin a year ago or 2 years ago, or even further back than that, as far back as what you have raw data. So that is when the core invalidate report data console command comes in. So as you can see in the example on the screen, in this example, we're running the invalidate report data console command. So this command always requires a dates option. As you can see in the example, we've got, for example, from the 1st of June up until today. So that will basically invalidate all report data for your entire Matomo instance going from the 1st of June till today. You can also use other types of date formats such as the last 30 or last 7 or last 90, things like that, to kind of just get a general date range invalidated. So some of you, if you're having a look at this, might be remembering that we do have what we call the invalidate reports plugin. That also allows you, as you can see in this example, to invalidate segments. The biggest difference, of course, between the plugin and the console command is that the plugin is kind of like what we would consider a sledgehammer when you're trying to invalidate report data. It doesn't necessarily differentiate between different specific dates or specific plugins. It's kind of an all or nothing deal. And that's where it really comes in handy, knowing how to work with these CLI commands. And you can combine a lot of these different options together to get some really specific date ranges or specific report data that you're looking for. So as you can see in the example over here, we've just put the plain text name of our segment. And in the next one, you'll see that we can now also invalidate some very specific plugins. So this is really where the CLI commands are a lot more useful than just invalidating report data in the UI. So when we combine all of these together, we get the ability to not only invalidate reports for a specific date range and for a specific segment, but also for a very specific plugin. So this is really, really useful, and once you've done all of this, of course, it then becomes necessary to reprocess that data. And that brings us to the very last step in this specific section, and that is reprocessing the report data that we've just invalidated using the force date range option. So in this example, we're looking at the last one that we used, the core invalidate report data, where we set the dates as the 1st of June to the last of June. And when we run this last core archive command with the force date range similar to or exactly matching what we've just invalidated, Matomo is going to only go ahead and process that specific date range for that specific plugin. So some plugins do actually have their own console commands that can be used for archiving, which we'll talk about in a minute. But what a lot of you are maybe wondering is like, oh, do I have to take a screenshot of this page? Do I have to memorize all of this information that's in front of me right now so that I know how to use it? And the great news is no, you don't have to memorize or take a screenshot of any of this data, because all of this is directly available when you run the console commands directly on your Matomo server. And we can find this information by using the --help option. Now the --help option when you're working with CLI commands is your absolute best friend. If you've ever forgotten what the specific command is or what type of input you need to give for a specific option, the dash dash help option is going to show that. So here, for example, in this slide, we've got the help output for the core archive command. So as you can see on the screen, hopefully the text isn't too small, we can see all of the potential options that we could add to this to kind of really narrow down and get some very specific commands that we can use for our server. So as I mentioned earlier, we do have some plugins that might have some very specific commands. A good example of a plugin that has its own archiving command is the custom reports plugin. So with the custom reports console command, it allows you to actually go in and specifically just archive the custom reports for a specific date range without needing to first invalidate that data. Now, a lot of you might be wondering, do I need to have a look at that? Do I need to go look at a guide for that sort of information? And here's the next really great tip is that no, you really don't have to know that information beforehand. The console command, if you just type in console on an SSH or in a terminal window in the Matomo root directory and you add the dash dash list option, it's going to give you a full list of all of the console commands that you can run directly on your Matomo server. And now that you've got this great list of console commands, you can then run those specific commands, each with their own dash dash help or dash help option, to get a list of all the optional parameters or required parameters that that specific plugin requires. So the important thing to remember whenever you're working on this thing is that just because a command works on one Matomo server doesn't necessarily mean that it works on every other Matomo server. And the reason for this is that every plugin that you install has the ability to add options to that list. So in other words, we're talking about all of these console commands can be or are in a lot of cases server specific. So if you're ever curious about how to run these console commands, how do I figure out how to use all of this stuff, use the list command, use the help command, and build your command from there. All right, so our next section is going to be useful free plugins, and these are specifically plugins that are not installed in Matomo by default, but are available to be downloaded and installed directly from within your Matomo instance without requiring any additional information. All you basically have to do is click download and install from your Matomo instance. And we're going to start with the first one on my list, at least, and in my opinion, one of the best free plugins that you can install, called the queue tracking plugin. So the queue tracking plugin, it improves the performance and the stability of your Matomo server by reducing the load on the Matomo database during tracking. It also, at the same time, really greatly improves the speed of tracking requests sent to your Matomo server. So how this works does take a little bit of an explanation. So we're going to do that now. So hopefully you'll see a graphic on your screen, and what we're looking at here is what we would consider a normal tracking request. So you can see up at the top there, the browser sends that HTTP tracking request. That tracking request then gets received by the Matomo server and needs to be processed. It's then inserted directly into the Matomo database, into that raw visits log, and then once it's inserted, we send that response to the browser. Now, the queue tracking plugin, this behavior changes in a few key ways. So as we can see on the next graphic, as soon as the Matomo server, so here at the top again, we can see the HTTP tracking request. As soon as that is received by the server, it's put into a queue, and then immediately the Matomo server responds to that browser or to that device or that application to say, great, I've got that tracking request, you can carry on. Once that tracking request is then placed into the queue, there's a few different things that can happen. Now, number one, you can either set up your Matomo instance to automatically process all of the requests that are in the queue when the queue reaches a certain threshold, but it can also be set up to be run on a schedule. So for example, you can process all of the requests in the queue once every minute or once every 2 or 3 minutes. And what this really does is that, like you saw in the beginning, it not only improves the tracker performance, but it also enables your Matomo server to handle very large traffic peaks without bringing down your database server. And the way that it does this is that instead of sending, small little individual single tracking requests every single time one of those tracking requests is received to the database server, it can process all of the tracking requests in that queue as a batch tracking request. So it really helps your Matomo server, and it really makes it a lot more stable and capable of handling those very large tracking peaks. All right, the next one on the list is the Tracking Spam Prevention plugin. So the Tracking Spam Prevention plugin gives you some really good options that you can enable to prevent spam tracking requests being sent or logged in your Matomo server. So it does this by giving you a couple of options. The first option it gives you is blocking requests from cloud providers. So this is really useful, for example, if you have a malicious or a bad actor that's sending you a lot of tracking requests from a server somewhere specifically in the world, and the problem might be that they're using a lot of different servers. You can't block all of those IP ranges. Well, the great news is the Tracking Spam Prevention plugin is going to really help you in that. Number two is that it can automatically block requests from headless browsers. Headless browsers are notorious for people that try to send these sorts of requests because the load that it puts in the device sending those requests is a lot lower than a fully fledged browser. Number three, it can restrict the number of actions in a single visit, or the maximum number of actions that Matomo will track in a single visit. This is especially useful to prevent spam visits that can sometimes track hundreds or even thousands of actions in a single visit. We've seen some examples with people that we've provided support to in the past from the Matomo team where they've had individual visits tracked over 10,000 actions in a single visit in a matter of minutes or even hours. And the great way is that you can automatically block this or cap the number of tracking requests that can be tracked in a single instance. And number four, it can exclude specific countries, or it can allow you to only include specific countries. So this is really useful. For example, if you have a website that is specifically targeting or specifically only working in a single country or in a single group of countries, to automatically exclude any tracking requests from countries outside of that. But it can also be useful to very quickly and easily exclude specific countries if you notice that you're getting a lot of spam or non-legitimate tracking requests from those countries. All right, the next plugin on the list, which is an absolute must-have, is the marketing campaigns reporting. So by default, Matomo will give you the option, or will give you the ability to track campaigns, and it comes with a really useful campaign URL builder directly in the Matomo UI. However, a lot of people, or let me rather say most people, probably already have campaigns set up that they're using to drive traffic to their site using campaign names that are oftentimes set up in their ad networks or with specific social networks. And the marketing campaigns reporting plugin extends that default capability, that default campaigns reporting, to give you access to all of the possible campaign parameters used by these platforms, as well as providing support for some of these campaign tracking parameters without needing to use any of the Matomo specific campaign parameters. We have a really great blog post available on our blog that you can go and read up about the marketing campaigns reporting, and I would definitely recommend installing it on your Matomo server. All right, the next one on the list is probably a little bit more for the Matomo administrators out there. So that's called the Log Viewer. So the Log Viewer is kind of more just a quality of life or convenience plugin that you can install to have a quick look at the Matomo application logs. So this can really save you some time and effort instead of having to SSH into your server and grep some logs or download your logs from your syslog server. You can just log into Matomo, go to your administration UI and have a look at the logs directly. All right. And the next one on our list is the Custom Alerts plugin. So the Custom Alerts plugin is really great, especially if you're not somebody who's looking at the reports every single day. And what the Custom Alerts plugin allows you to do is to get notified when something changes or something specific happens in your Matomo instance or on the websites that you're tracking. For example, you can set up an alert when your website gets more than 300 views in a day. You can have another alert set up, for example, if a specific product sells less than 100 items in a specific time frame. But alerts can be set up in other ways as well. For example, you can set up alerts as percentages. So you can set up an alert, for example, that notifies you if the traffic to your website drops by more than 50% in a given time frame. And obviously, a 50% drop over a given time frame probably indicates that something big has changed or something has happened. You can also set it up for if you have 0 visits. Now, obviously, 0 visits would be a pretty bad outcome for you. You want to be sure that you're getting all of the tracking data and that nothing is wrong with that tracking data. So for those types of alerts, you can actually set them up not only as an email alert, but also as an SMS alert. So if you're setting up an SMS alert, you'll need to make sure that you also set up the mobile messaging plugin. Now, the mobile messaging plugin is included in Matomo Core, but it might not be activated on your Matomo server. So if you want to set up SMS alerts with a custom alerts plugin, you'll need to go ahead and activate that plugin as well. And the last plugin on our list for today is the IP2 Company plugin. This one kind of explains itself. What it does is it adds the functionality to your Matomo server to easily see if visits to your website or app are connecting from any known IP ranges for specific companies. So this is really useful, especially for if your website or even your marketing campaigns are specifically targeting a certain market segment or even a very specific company. It also provides you some reports for these as well, so you can see which companies are visiting your website or using your application more than others. And all of these plugins can be found on the Matomo plugins website at plugins.matomo.org. There is a massive list of plugins that didn't make the cut, unfortunately, for this session today. So if you're ever curious, or if you wanted to know how you can extend the capability of your Matomo server, have a look at the list of plugins available there. And alternatively, you can also find them in the marketplace section of your Matomo server. From there, you can directly install and activate and start using these awesome plugins. All right, and that brings us to the end of the last segment for this MatomoCamp session. So we're going to move on to some question and answers now. So if you haven't yet had an opportunity to send some questions through to the chat, just going to take a minute. The moderator has sent some questions through to us on the chat on this side as well, so we'll just have a quick look through those questions and see if we can answer some of them. How is it like to work for the Matomo or Intercraft team? This is a question from Ronan. Honestly, it's been probably one of the best work experiences that I've ever had in my life. The team is amazing. It's awesome to work in a group of people that are conscious about open source software, conscious about being open and sharing, and it's really just a great company culture overall. What are the next big features the team is working on? So yeah, there's not a lot of big secrets when it comes to how, what sort of features we're working on. If you want to know what features we're working on next, you can probably have a look at the GitHub issues page, and you can kind of see, looking at those milestones on the GitHub page, you can kind of get a feeling of what features are going to be worked on next, what is the priority for those sorts of things. Can we add new shortcuts with Matomo? This is actually something I'm not 100% sure on. I don't think we have the option to have keyboard shortcuts, but that's definitely something that I'll have a look at and ask the team about as well. Do we have any plans to develop more documentation about how to make more attractive teams? So I'm not sure who asked that question specifically, but we do actually have a developer's guide available on our developer documentation on how to create themes. Obviously, there's not necessarily very specific examples of what you can do. The main reason for that is that it's kind of really open. If you know a little bit about CSS, or you know a little bit about less, you can go happy and hack away all day, every day, and create really cool customized themes. Something that I may not have mentioned earlier is that you're not just limited to using CSS or less. You can also include JavaScript files in your plugins to kind of extend it even further than what CSS or less would allow you to do. All right, Linaro asks in the chat room, does the spam prevention work retroactive to filter out already made spam visits? No, so that the tracking spam prevention plugin doesn't work retroactively. So this is something that you would need to install to prevent future spam tracking requests. If you do have very specific spam tracking requests, the best way to get rid of that data or those spam tracking requests is to use the GDPR tools available within Matomo. And that can be kind of useful, especially if they've, for example, all of the tracking requests came from a certain IP address, or if they came from a certain country, or they track certain specific things to your Matomo instance. You can use those GDPR tools to very quickly and easily delete all of that data. All right, that's all of the some of the questions that we've got on the. Are we having any plans to make the config.ini.php file accessible from the UI? No, I don't think we've got any plans to make that config file editable from within the UI, but it is possible to view the config file from the UI, not necessarily just limited to the config.ini.php, but there is a section under the diagnostics tab that you can actually go and have a look at all of the settings that are currently set, either in the global config file or the config.ini.php within your Matomo instance. The reason why we wouldn't necessarily make it directly editable from the UI is because a lot of the settings that you set in the config.ini.php can override some of the settings that you might set in your user interface. All right, just having a look for a couple more questions. Do you have any tips for solving upgrade issues? Sometimes the upgrade fails and the database and core are not the same version. There have been several questions on this in the forum, but there isn't a good solution. That's a really great question, and it's actually something that I helped one or two customers with in the last couple of weeks as well. It might be really useful from our end just to put that into an FAQ. It's something that I've kind of been planning to do as well. But yes, there is actually a way that you can roll back the version that is stored in the database so that Matomo can rerun all of those database upgrade commands. So stay tuned. I don't know if you have any way that you can kind of keep an eye on some of the FAQs. Otherwise, feel free to shoot us an email at support@matomo.org, just asking about that information about those specific steps. And if we don't yet have that FAQ out there, we'll be more than happy to send that information on to you. Could you give a general definition of what archiving means? Yeah. So archiving is basically the process that Matomo uses to kind of process all of that raw data. So as you can imagine, if you're sending hundreds of thousands of tracking requests or hits to your Matomo interface, that data on its own isn't really useful other than just to kind of look at in reality. So what archiving does is it takes that raw data and it parses through every single piece of that raw data, and that is used to then generate the reports that you view in your Matomo instance. All right. Anyone else got a couple more questions for us? All right. That looks like all the questions for today. Um, So that means that we're actually almost out of time. I really just wanted to say thank you everyone for joining. Thank you so much for the awesome questions that you asked. I hope that everybody learned something new today that will help give you success with Matomo. And I'd also like to give a massive thank you to the volunteers that have made MatomoCamp possible. This really is a community-driven event, and none of this would be possible without the awesome contribution of the volunteers as well as the sponsors. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Many thanks.